virtual greetings, NE3003 class. My name is Connor. I'll be your tutor for the first debate topic, which will look at whether or not we can meet the goals of the Paris Agreement without rethinking some of our rather luxurious lifestyles and perhaps questioning an economy which focuses on continuous consumption and growth. So there are two sides to this debate. Well, I've dubbed the techno-evangelists fighting in the red corner. So these are the people that think we can solve this problem with technology and innovation. And they're the kind of person that probably already has a lot of technology integrated in their life and put a lot of faith in technology. So they want to have smart devices all over their home so they can monitor their energy, or they can turn the lights off when they're not there and keep an eye on their heating. And they want a self-driving car because it's cool, it's flashy. They can check their heartbeat monitor as they speed around the corners without, putting themselves in danger. On the other side, then, fighting in the blue corner, we have what I've dubbed the techno skeptics. So these are people who would maybe question some of our uses of technology and look at, some of the negative consequences of technology. It's not all positive. And perhaps these people would look at, some more simple solutions. So choosing a bike over a car, or deciding to put on a jumper instead of relying on a temperature monitor to keep you at a constant temperature. So I'm going to go through the sort of technology options that we have available, try to meet our carbon emission targets, and then some sort of alternative kind of options in social innovation and behavioral change, which are not as discussed as much as the technology side of things. I will try to be objective, kind of talk about the red and the blue, where both are strong in each element. But to be upfront, I am personally very much on the blue side and professionally, so that might come through. I've tried to stop myself, but it's probably inevitable that it comes up a little bit. So very quick recap, the goal that we were talking about, the Paris Agreement. So we've agreed that within this century we should keep temperatures at an absolute max of 2 degrees Celsius, and probably a 1.5 degrees Celsius is a safer target to aim for. And this was kind of confirmed by the IPCC a couple of years ago. They said, the difference between 1.5 and 2 is maybe worse than we thought. And then also they, this big warning, they said, in our current rate, we're going to expend this budget by 2030. So we really need to act, fast, and we need a drastic overhaul on our current energy system. So this, warning was kind of reiterated, I suppose, 2 weeks ago for anybody that tuned in to the World Energy Outlook launch. The two things that I found most striking from this were the fact that we've already agreed to build or are currently operating enough fossil fuel power plants to breach this target. So we've already, decided to emit more carbon than we've said is safe. So we need some sort of way of removing carbon from the atmosphere, or else we're going to break the target, regardless of what we do. And then the second one, which is the bottom graph there, which, apologies, is a little bit grainy because I've taken it from a Twitter post. I couldn't find it anywhere else. But it highlights what we would achieve with our current net zero pledges, which are already highly ambitious, and how far then we still have to go. So there's quite a large gap still to fill there, and a lot of questions about how we're going to do that. There is, this isn't just a technical problem. Obviously, it's just a bit of a political issue here with big player like the US not being at the table, but that's a topic for a different day, perhaps. So if we're going to meet this climate target, then one of the biggest things that we have to solve it is renewable energy, and this comes in many forms: solar PV, onshore, offshore wind, hydro, and then you've got the slightly less proven ones in tidal energy and other offshore options. The example I've given here is off the solar PV, just to highlight really how dramatic the growth in these technologies is predicted to be. So we're going to build 3 times the amount of solar in the next 10 years than we've built in the last 10 years. It's a real significant increase, which, I mean, is great. Obviously, this replaces a lot of filthy fossil fuel powered plants, but it brings with it some problems. What we tend to rely on is solar PV and onshore, offshore wind, onshore to a larger extent. And these are intermittent renewables, so they're not always available. The sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow. So on the one hand, they're fantastic, clean and essentially free fuel source, but this fuel source is not always there. We can't decide when the sun shines and we can't decide when the wind blows. So if you take, for example, Saturday night, France are playing Ireland in rugby. At about half time, there will likely be a dramatic spike in electricity usage in Ireland, but there won't be an associated spike in wind. So what do we do to stop the grid crashing? We need some other way of controlling our electricity. So either we need some form of storage, which has got to be pretty significant. We need a power source that we control as well as conventional fossil fuel plants at the moment, or we need interconnection. So we can connect to countries that have other sources of power. So the sun might not be shining in Ireland, but it's shining down in France, or we can hook up a load of solar panels in the Sahara to power Europe. So we probably need a combination of all three. But all I wanted to highlight here was that renewables are part of the problem solution, not part of the problem, part of addressing the problem, but they bring their own associated problem with grid management. So we need something else to support the renewables. And one of the probably technologies that gets the most attention then, particularly well from proponents of nuclear energy, because in one sense, yes, theoretically, this is unlimited clean power source, which was certainly when I did leaving cert physics and I learned about nuclear power, I thought, this is it. Why are we bothering with wind or solar? This is clearly the answer. And there's this concept that we could build small modular reactors so they can be safe and controlled and we can export them all over the world. But it's not there yet. It's a concept. It's not currently in existence. So we're relying on something that's unproven to a certain extent. And there are those that wouldn't accept nuclear in any form, even if it's new and improved. The disasters that we've had in the past have really cast a very dark shadow over the idea of nuclear energy. So it's difficult to see how this one would go. You have countries like Germany that are getting rid of their nuclear, and then you have countries like France that are still building more nuclear. So if we can't have nuclear because the technology is not there or we don't think it's safe, then we're probably still going to have to emit some sort of fossil fuel power. And that would mean that we need some way of getting rid of the carbon that we're still burning and using. So the most simplest form of this is carbon offsetting, which is currently used quite a few places. So we still use our fossil fuel as normal, but we pay for some renewable energy in a foreign place and we plant some trees, and then this offsets the amount of carbon. So we can say that although we emitted carbon, we got rid of it somewhere else. So it cancels out. It doesn't really work. It's a little bit like the GIF, which unfortunately isn't working on the screen. And to date, the problem with carbon offsetting has really been that it's been taken by a corporate agenda and it's just been completely greenwashing. So you have Ryanair say they're the greenest airline in Europe, despite the fact they're the 10th largest emitter beside a load of coal plant operators. So they're the only non-coal plant operator that's on this list, and they claim that they're the greenest airline in Europe. And then you have recently in Ireland, Apple Green trying to claim they have carbon neutral petrol because for the petrol that you use, they plant trees somewhere else. So this is, it's bullshit. There's no other way to say it, really. I've put a report there, which I recommend you check out, maybe if you want to look into this, to put together kind of principles of good carbon offsetting. But at the moment, it's not, very well managed, and it's a bit shady. And the idea that this can help us solve climate change it's flawed. It's misguided. In addition to the carbon offsetting, we also have a number of options of carbon capture, which we could deploy. The proposals to do this is what's called carbon capture and storage, which is the idea that we can put things in the exhausts or the chimneys of the power plants that will catch the CO2, and then we can pump it underground into the disused oil and gas fields that we have, and we can bury it and we can get rid of it. And so we still have that stability that we need on the grid from our gas power plant, but it's not emitting CO2 anymore. So there's an example. This is kind of proposed for the Corrib gas field in Ireland, because that gas field is going to empty soon. You already have gas power plants nearby, so why not, instead of gas going from the field to the plant, turn that pump around and put all the horrible emissions into the ground. There's a couple of issues. There's the financial risk. What happens if the CO2 leaks in future? So when I put the CO2 in, it's like 50, 100 euro a ton, but in 30 years when it leaks out, it could be 500 euro a ton, maybe even 1,000. So that's a huge amount of money. And then that would also do untold environmental damage if there's a big leakage when we're already at a very sensitive amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. And then also there's the argument that this kind of, goes against what we're trying to achieve here. This is just business as usual. Stick a large Hoover over it rather than a Band-Aid, but it's not addressing the problem, and it might distract us from where we need to reduce our energy, like in the heating of homes and areas of transport that we could work better on. But it is probably part of the picture. I mean, it's hard not to see the need for something because we have to have that grid stability. So from a technological point of view, it's very difficult to see a world where we don't have something like this. So yeah, moving on from this, then we have the idea that we can use the CO2 that we capture. So it's not connected to the power plant, I should say. Instead, we put large fans out into the desert. We gather up carbon from the atmosphere, and then we can synthesize it into fuel, which we can put into jets, boats, or the trucks that are very difficult to decarbonize. They can't really, it's hard to get renewable replacements for their current fuels. And then they emit the CO2, but we catch it again. So it's kind of a perfect cycle of CO2. But there's a few problems with this. Well, at least I think there's a couple of problems. The first is this could be quite energy intensive, and we're going to have to build more renewables than we already need to power these large fans to suck CO2, which is maybe okay if those, so it's kind of indirectly those renewables are powering planes or boats or something like that. But then also the second problem, which is probably the biggest one, is that this doesn't remove CO2 from the atmosphere. So it just uses we keep the amount of CO2 that we already have in the atmosphere going around in a perfect circle, but we don't get rid of any CO2. And if you remember at the start, we talked about the fact that we've already actually probably spent the carbon budget, or at least planned to spend it. So what we really need is some form of negative emissions technologies or a way of getting CO2 out of the air. One really effective way of doing that, which is not actually technology related at all and predates humans, is nature. Trees are fantastic. The trees like to breathe CO2 and then give out oxygen, whereas we are the opposite. We take in oxygen and give out CO2. Yeah, so this here example is from a Nature paper which looked at the savings potential from putting in reforesting areas around the equator that have been deforested and trying to give back areas to nature. So this gets tied a lot to the biodiversity issues because we've we kind of destroyed nature and turned it into farms. So perhaps we need to rethink how we manage nature and just leave it be. And the carbon offsetting that I spoke about earlier, it's a bit shady, and there are definitely current examples in Ireland with the forestry that is not very well done. It needs to be proper natural forest. What we have at the moment is this economically efficient monoculture where it's just one type of tree that grows fastest and can be sold at the quickest rate. But that's not, returning to wild and natural. It's horrible dead ground thing. So you need carefully managed carbon sequestration. And yeah, this can also be done with the peatlands and re-wetting them. So it's a couple of options here. So the final thing I want to talk about on carbon capture is BECCS, bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. This kind of combines that last idea with the first. So if we have trees which suck in carbon and then we burn them and we get useful energy, but we don't let the CO2 get released, we actually store it underground, we catch it again, then we get negative emissions. We have, in this very simple example, if I steal the numbers from that, we can take in -9 CO2, but still. So this is really comes up a lot in the models because having -9 CO2 is very useful if you have something like agriculture, which is very difficult to get to zero, or some areas of transport. So I can still have, say, 7 CO2 coming out of my agricultural emissions, but it's okay because I have -9 thanks to my BECCS. So I get -2 overall. So it's still net carbon negative. So finally is geoengineering on the technical side of things. This is something that I haven't looked into a huge amount. I just wanted to flag it for those techno enthusiasts amongst you. On the red side, you can maybe look into it a little bit more. It seems a bit mad to me, really. It's the kind of proposals like we could block out the sun with mirrors up in the sky, or we can spray chemicals into the clouds that will catch the CO2 and make it fall down, or we can spray stuff into the ocean. Yeah, there's a whole load of dystopian Doctor Evil technologies to try to control the world, which maybe is necessary if we're definitely going to emit more CO2 than is safe, but it's a very dangerous territory to get into because it's playing God, and we're not really what happens next if we do put all this weird stuff into the ocean, and then that turns out that that makes it actually worse rather than better. And yeah, I think Mother Nature should be left alone as much as possible. We've already interfered too much. But as I said, it's from a technological point of view, there's some really fascinating stuff in here. So in the red corner, look it up. Okay, so that's just to conclude on the kind of technology side of things. I want to talk about why we generally focus on technology, and it's a kind of an inherent problem in the models that we use when we try to make climate policy. Maybe Hannah has touched on this already. So the models are, look at how to replace a suite of technologies that we have now with technologies that would be compliant with, net zero emissions or some other carbon target, which means that they usually look at a switching of technology. So it's how do we get rid of this technology for this renewable technology, and it does spends a lot less time looking at the energy demand that these technologies are trying to meet. So it doesn't look at what we call demand side measures, reducing the energy demand by doing different things. Generally, actually, the energy demand increases because I'll touch on that in a minute. And yeah, then the second point to make is that experts can place a lot of kind of extra faith in their technologies. They're overly optimistic, perhaps, about how successful it would be. You can see this with hydrogen, people pushing that. The same with nuclear. People very, kind of adamant that it's the answer when they're pro-nuclear. And there's offshore ocean renewables as well. We don't know when they will be available or useful, when they're going to become cost effective. But people who are in research for them would say, it's coming, it's coming, it's coming. Just wait. So it's hard to know exactly when. And then the final point to make is that's going back to the first point, I suppose, that when we do look at measures other than switches in technology, we can see that there are significant climate benefits. So something like changing our diets can have a very positive impact. I think this was exemplified by the Cowspiracy movie, really popularized this idea and has resulted in quite a large sweep of vegetarian and veganism. So sticking with this idea of behavior change and going back to the World Energy Outlook report, as I said, there was a large gap that they were looking at between where we need to be and where we actually are based on our current pledges. So they had to look at different measures that would get us down to that gap. And one of the big things they looked at was behavior and the different behavior elements that could do that. So things like if we walked for short distances instead of driving, the benefits of working from home, reducing indoor air temperatures just a little bit, people flying less, and these all have large impacts because obviously the easiest and the cheapest energy saved is the one that we don't actually use. So we don't have to come up with a renewable source for it because it doesn't exist. It's free. But there is, I mean, these are all well and good, but I mean, I dislike them because they place a lot of emphasis on the individual. Usually, it's about you're not doing the right thing. You're bad for the climate, which is not a good way to position these things because then it's kind of people get defensive. Quality of life. They're also usually associated with like a poorer quality of life or whatever. This is something that they should do. Sort of, it's given a very negative image. And I think, particularly when you look at something like flying, the idea that people are going to agree to fly less for a purely ecological or environmental reason, like that enough people would agree to that, I think, it's unlikely. So that's why people would tend to think social change, it's very slow and difficult to implement these sort of behavior changes. Another thing I want to introduce here to step back a little bit is the idea of social innovation. So this is not necessarily a behavior change, but it's more how we organize as a group of people. And so, I mean, social innovation doesn't have to be for the purpose of energy or climate. It can happen for a whole other things like homelessness or looking after elderly people. But what I want to highlight is these are things that we can't predict in our climate models or energy system models that we use to try to figure out what we're going to decarbonize, but they can have a huge positive impact. You look at something like that human barrier that they've created in Dublin makes cycling really safe. Some more people cycle, but how can we predict that that's going to happen? We have no way of knowing. And how can we, predict how much of an impact it would have? It's impossible to quantify. And then, yeah, so also I had the idea there of the carpool WhatsApp from some work I'm doing in the Dingle Peninsula. One of the things that they've organized is a group chat, so you can, say I'm going to Tralee tomorrow. Does anybody want to come with? And it's makes carpooling very safe and accessible for people. So it greatly speeds up the use of that service. But again, how could you predict that something like that would happen, and how can you quantify it? And food sharing there again is another example. So I'm not going to get into too much on these. I just wanted to highlight that we shouldn't only talk about kind of individual action and behaviors. When what happens a lot when we go into this whatever social side of things is we still take a very technology focused. So we only talk about reduction in use of technologies rather than, other things that could happen, like us organizing differently as a society and how that would have a larger impact perhaps. And so the other thing I want to highlight then is just to return to that idea of behavior change and that negative image. So when I talked about eating less meat earlier, perhaps a lot of you probably had the picture of this guy in your head. He's some smelly hippie that wants to live in the forest by himself. And he only eats these weird green burgers and he has no problem wearing socks and sandals. And I mean, yes, at the extreme, there are those, kind of anti-capitalist, anti-consumer people that would probably fit into this category, but not everybody is ever going to agree to this. That's the important thing. We have to realize, we have to make this a kind of, I don't want to use the word mainstream, but it needs to have a majority of people agree to it. And if a majority of people end up living in the forest, that would actually create more problems than, help. So what we need is, little changes. Like not everyone has to be a vegan, but maybe if people had a few days a week where they didn't eat meat, that would have a big impact. And to just talk about these kind of incremental changes rather than just associating it with this, dramatic change and reduction in quality of life. Like you kind of lose the point here when you're talking about this things. What we're really saying is that what we need to think is a sort of a rebalancing. So there's this idea that there should be a minimum social floor. So there's a kind of minimum acceptable quality of life for everybody. So we need, school, we need education, we need health, well-being, clean water and stuff. And, everybody in the world should have this kind of minimum baseline. But then also we know that we have this kind of upper level that we cannot exceed our planetary boundaries. We have a limited amount of resources, limited amount of emissions we can put out before we are in danger zone. At the moment, we have this problem where us rich few have, greatly exceeded the amount of emissions we can put out. Well, there's still a whole lot of people that are living in poverty and have terrible qualities of life. So we need to find some way of bringing this up to a more level playing field, which means we might need to rethink how we, judge what a good country is and what a good society looks like. At the moment, the most prominent measure of a country or a society is GDP and how much our society is growing. So how big our economy is and how much it will grow next year. That's kind of what they always talk about. If you watched the budget a few weeks ago, it's like next year we're not going to grow, but hopefully we'll return to growth in 2021. We're not going to disappear. I mean 2022. Sorry. So hopefully it's not a complete disaster. Growth will return. It's all going to be okay. And this is because we've kind of usually associated growth with well-being. So as economies got bigger, they could pay, for better public health, public education. People lived longer and had better lives. So it was a clear link, but it's a little bit flawed. It overlooks a lot of things. Like I've highlighted here the Irish example. I do apologize to people that are international because I've talked to Irish examples throughout this thing. Probably I am Irish, so that does tend to happen. But yes, Ireland is one of the wealthiest, healthiest countries in the world, according to this graph. Like we are a model country. But if you live in Ireland and you're familiar with the Irish healthcare system, you might say, hang on a minute. Are we really? Can we really put ourselves up there as one of the healthiest, wealthiest countries in the world? I think, this is perhaps. Now, I mean, in Ireland, it's a funny case, of course, because this is inflated by the fact that we're a tax haven. So it is a little bit unjudged. They actually had to come up with a new thing, gross national income, to try to figure out how much wealth the people have instead of just the country. Because if you've got multinationals reporting a lot of income in a country, it tends to skew this figure. But that's a topic for a different day. The one thing I wanted to highlight is that we need to maybe rethink our relationship with growth and not depend upon continuous growth and consumption first to provide a good quality of life. And then there are examples in the Netherlands. There's been research to show that we actually decoupled from growth, so we're not dependent on growth anymore in developed countries. The reason this relationship between GDP and our well-being is such a problem is because the other thing that GDP is quite closely related to is ecological destruction and environmental damage. You can see here this graph of the EU, all countries in the world, but the EU member states are highlighted in red there. So we're some of the wealthiest, but we're also got some of the highest footprints in terms of the amount of land that we need per person. So this is a big problem, and obviously moving into the future, if we want to continue to grow, but we know that we can't, increase our ecological footprint for all these countries down in that corner in the bottom left there. We have to find a way of decoupling growth and our well-being. So we need to rethink how we, balance our society and what we strive to. Should we just be striving to maximize economic gain, or are there other things that would be better? So one of the proposals for an alternative to GDP, you can't just get rid of GDP. Obviously, that would be a little bit crazy. The whole makeup of our global, diplomacy is kind of based on it, and that's why we have, powerful countries like the USA in this, and how they became powerful because they're the largest economies. And the idea, and GDP works very effective because it's a one number that we can all kind of stick to and then compare, contrast universally. Whereas the stuff like wellness and kind of happiness and quality of life is maybe more like perceptive. Different peoples and cultures might have different interpretations of what their well-being should be defined as. So it's a little bit trickier, but we should at least consider alternative ways of measuring it. So this here is a proposal from the Social Progress Imperative, and they've developed what's called the Social Progress Index. Every year they produce this Social Progress Index, and it looks at a range of things within the country and ranks them. So it takes the country's GDP and then compares how different services within the country, or rights and abilities of citizens, compare to other countries with a similar GDP. So sticking with that Ireland example, with like the sixth highest GDP in the world, sixth wealthiest country, but we only rank 12th when we look at the Social Progress Index. And you can see, despite being the sixth richest, we're the 45th when it comes to healthcare. So there's a huge gap there between what is our supposed wealth and the actual well-being of our people. And that's why we need to perhaps consider different alternatives to growth and this pursuit of consumption to measure our success by. So to conclude, we have a responsibility to reflect on and to control the technology use in our society, to ask what is the right technology and what innovations is it always positive and impact in society, or does it bring about negative things? Something like a smartphone. There's a very clear impact from a smartphone on our society. Is it all good, and how do we manage and control the bad to mitigate them? And then the two sides of the debate. So in the first, those who disagree with the statement that we need to alter lifestyles and economy, you guys are going to be pitching for technological innovations. I've touched on a lot of the technologies available. I didn't mention hydrogen. Maybe that's worth bringing up as well, the hydrogen economy and the potential there. And whatever else I might have missed, I don't know. I'm sure you guys could come up with some cool things. You're engineers for the most part. So you guys need to argue that, the whole kumbaya, let's get together around the fire is a nice idea, but we have to act really fast now. So we don't have enough time to, try to fix this division in our society and this inequality. We just need to focus on addressing this problem. And then the guys who would be counter-arguing that would say, yes, the technology is great, but it's unproven. A lot of these technologies are not used yet, so how can we guarantee they're going to work? And we do know that there are things that we can do behaviorally that we can reduce the amount of energy and then subsequently the emissions. So maybe that's a good route to fly down. And then also, just as a measure of success, if we have achieved a 1.5 degree temperature limit, but we haven't changed anything in our society, we're still got this division and inequality. Have we really addressed the problem? And have we really got that nice, happy, healthy, sustainable society that we want?